Redefining the fashion industry, our next speaker was the first British Indian model to front brands like Burberry and L'Oreal Cosmetics UK. But she's just as prolific in her advocacy, breaking down barriers to diversity, representation, and equality through her social justice work. Here to tell us her story, touching on powerful topics of culture, identity, and abuse, welcome fashion model, brand ambassador, and spokesperson, Neelam Gill.
Okay, so to start, I'm going to tell you guys about my story. My name is Neelam Gill. I'm 26 and I'm a model and activist. I began modeling when I was 18 years old, and that was when I was the first Indian model for Burberry and many other brands. But before that, my journey began when I was just a young brown girl growing up in Coventry. I never grew up feeling pretty. I never grew up feeling like I could be a model. I never grew up feeling like these opportunities even existed to me, because when I was growing up, I didn't feel represented in the mainstream media. The only things I could look towards were Bollywood, but I'm also British and I'm born here. So I felt proud of my Indian heritage, but I felt equally proud to be British. So that's why I think now with the work I do, I'm so focused on diversity and representation and making people feel seen and heard, because I know how it feels to grow up feeling otherwise. When I was young, my parents got divorced, and I always grew up feeling like a little bit out of place. And I started modeling when I was 18. My career really, really took off, which I was very grateful for. And a few years after that, I was at a place in my life where I was happy on paper. I was achieving everything you could think of in the world, but inside I was unhappy because I found the industry very empty. I felt very lonely. I was used to traveling and working on my own from a very young age, and I was very isolated, having to invest so much into my career. I didn't really have any friends, didn't have any family, had to move across the world. And I entered an abusive relationship where I was in that for 2.5 years. And this is a relationship I would say that really shaped me as a woman. I think it broke me down and gave me my power, made me regain my strength. And now I feel ready to talk about it in hopes of helping others, because I never want people to feel what I felt and feel so alone. And I know that I'm aware that I have a platform, and I'm aware that I have a voice. And I would want to do everything in my power to help others who are in the situation, or to at least raise awareness on this issue, because it's so widespread and it affects so many people. So recently I did a TED talk, and one of my favorite quotes from it is, "We live in the 21st century, yet misogyny and sexism are deeply embedded into the schemes of our society." And this is one of my favorite quotes because I think it covers a multitude of issues. Misogyny and sexism is embedded into our society in the Western world in general. I think everyone can attest to that. But I also think for me, growing up, being an Indian girl, Punjabi, being a part of the South Asian community, we're brought up to believe that we have to serve men. This isn't everyone's experience, but this is a very widespread experience within the community. And that's why I think as a community, we suffer a lot when it comes to abuse or abuse related crimes, whether that's domestic violence, whether that's honor killings. It's a really, really huge issue within our community, and I think it needs to be spoken about. And I think it starts from childhood. For example, when I was growing up, as a girl, you're always taught to obey the men in your household. As a girl, I would see visitors come over, relatives come over, and the men sit in another room. The men, you serve them their food first, they eat first, they get priority. And also as a kid, I would grow up seeing abuse within my family, but I just didn't know it at the time. A few members of my family were in abusive relationships, and it was the norm. And everyone knew that their partner was abusive, but they weren't able to leave because they had kids. And it also went against the image in the community. Also, my nanny's sister, she was murdered by her husband, and he served a life sentence in prison. And only when I got older and I went through the relationship I did myself, and I started doing research and looking into the figures, I realized that I'm actually at a higher chance of being in an abusive relationship because it's ran in my family for generations. I didn't even realize that until I got older and started doing my own research. And on top of that, I think misogyny and sexism is embedded into my job now as a model, because I've achieved a lot in my career, and I'm aware that I've achieved a lot being a brown girl. There's not many girls like me. the industry is moving to become more diverse, but I still think there's a long way to go. But with that, I face a lot of misogyny and sexism because I'm very outspoken, I'm very honest, I'm very empathetic, and I always want to shed light on issues that I feel are important. But when I do that, I get met with some resistance because some people still view me as a mannequin. And I think with my job comes this very like reductive mind state that I should just stand there and be pretty and be happy that I have a little foot in the door. And I think that is misogynistic because why can't I be a woman and why can't I, be a model and be known for my looks, but also be smart and also want to speak up and also be interested in politics and the world and helping others? Why do I have to be in a box? Why can't I be one dimensional? I think as women or as human beings in general, we're so multifaceted that we don't have to be boxed in. We don't have to be one thing. We can be a multitude of whatever we're passionate about. There's so much that I want to see change when it comes to the topic of victim blaming and the stigma around abuse. And I know that because I faced it myself. When I went through that relationship, I felt shame for a number of years. And even to this day, I still feel very uncomfortable because it's a difficult concept to grasp that one half of me is so strong and so independent and so fearless and so outspoken that it's painful to think that I lost a lot of myself in that relationship. I was a shell of the woman who I am now, and you mourn a part of yourself because when you're in a relationship like that, it's like a part of you dies. And that's difficult to accept, But I also think a lot needs to change when it comes to victim blaming, even when it comes down to language. Language used is so important. One of the biggest struggles I faced in even opening up about my story is people's disbelief. I think for people, they need to be so aware and so sensitive of how their responses can make someone feel, can make a victim feel who's already going through so much mentally, physically, emotionally. If they choose to open up to you and say, this is what I've been going through, be mindful of your language, be mindful of your body language. Don't say, why did you stay? Why did you stay? Or why did you stay so long? I mean, statistically, it takes a victim 17 times to leave their abuser. And I always say it to people, I'm like, if you're in an abusive relationship with someone and they're abusive to you when you're together, what do you think they're going to do when you're apart? They're not just going to let you go. It's an issue of control. And also, they're abusive to you. So you feel your life and your safety is at risk. And that's not a silly fear to have, it's a very real fear to have. And another thing that I think needs to be done when it comes to victim blaming is supporting the victim. I think in the situation, a lot of people blame the victim instead of the abuser. Even the tone with why didn't you leave, that puts the blame on the victim. Actually, the blame should be towards the abuser of why did they do this to you? This should have never happened to you. I'm so sorry. What could I do to help you? That would be more beneficial instead of interrogating the victim, because trust me, we've already gone through that 10,000 times in our head already of questioning ourselves of how could we let this happen to us, because as I said earlier, when you're in that dynamic, a large part of you dies in that relationship and you have to mourn that old version of yourself. My call to action for anyone who's going through this, anyone who may be seeing signs of going through this, is to know that you're not alone. And I know that sounds very cliche, but I don't mean it in a cliche way. I mean it from my heart. I'm talking from experience. I suffered in silence for so many years because I was so ashamed. I was ashamed at myself for letting this happen to me. And I realized that this wasn't my fault. As victims, we carry so much shame and so much blame, and we blame ourselves and we think, was it us? Did I do something wrong? And actually, in sharing my story, I've gained so much strength and so much perspective from others, from talking to other people who've been through this scenario. I've created a sisterhood, I've created a sense of unity, and I've realized that we take on so much as victims. And actually, we need to give ourselves credit, for being survivors, because most people in that situation wouldn't be able to handle it the way we do. Many victims still have jobs to uphold. They may be mothers, fathers, and I think we should be applauding ourselves for getting through those tough times instead of beating ourselves down. My call to action to government would be to recognize the gravity of the issue of domestic violence and abuse in general. The figures in lockdown alone show that abuse has skyrocketed during lockdown, and that's because victims were physically not able to leave their abuser. I know for me, being in an abusive relationship, my only sense of sanity or peace was knowing that I could go to work or he may be out of the house. During lockdown, the thought of people being physically not able to leave their abuser, I couldn't even sleep knowing. And that's why the figures were through the roof. And I think the government needs to do more to help victims, because in this time, the people who've been really helpful are grassroots charities. The government needs to do more within reforming their laws, because even, for example, if a victim wants to get help with the police or file a restraining order, they have to remove themselves from the abuser, whereas we're the ones that should be protected. I feel within this situation, the abuser is still given a certain privilege. And really, the victim should be able to stay where we are, and the abuser should be the one that's removed from the situation. I would love to see government taking steps to understand this issue on a deeper level, instead of keeping it in these archaic bills and reforms that have been around for decades and decades.